What would you do if a painting you created began to watch you back? In tonight's tale, we explore the story of an artist whose masterpiece takes on a life of its own. The portrait's eyes seem to follow his every move, and soon, it's more than just a painting. It's a reflection of something darker. Welcome to episode 12 of Whispers in the Dark, Late Night Tales, and the unsettling story of the portrait that watches.
For years, Thomas had been an artist. He lived and breathed painting, his studio filled with canvases of every size and colour. But there was one painting, his latest masterpiece, that was different from the rest. It had started innocently enough, just like any other project. A portrait of a man, his eyes deep and reflective, staring straight ahead. But as the days passed, something about the painting began to unsettle Thomas. He couldn't explain it at first. It was just a feeling, a strange unease every time he looked into the eyes of his subject. The portrait seemed to change subtly over time. The expressions in the man's face shifted ever so slightly, almost as if the painting was alive. Thomas brushed it off as his imagination, a trick of the light, or perhaps just the exhaustion of working too many late nights. But the changes became impossible to ignore. One evening, while working late in his dimly lit studio, Thomas caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of his eye. He froze, turning slowly toward the portrait. The man's eyes, they were watching him. Thomas's heart raced as he stepped closer, studying the painting. The man's gaze seemed to follow him wherever he moved, the deep, painted eyes locking onto his every step. It was impossible. It was just paint, just a portrait. But the more he stared, the more he felt that something was terribly wrong. He tried to put the portrait away to hide it under a sheet, but no matter where he moved it in the room, he could feel those eyes on him. The weight of the gaze followed him, creeping into his mind, filling his dreams with strange, vivid images of the man in the painting. One night, Thomas awoke in a cold sweat, his heart pounding. He had dreamed that the man from the portrait had stepped out of the canvas, his painted form taking on a life of its own. He could still hear the faint echo of footsteps in his studio, could still feel the chill of those eyes watching him. He tried to rationalize it, telling himself it was just stress, just his mind playing tricks on him. But the next morning, when he entered his studio, he found the portrait on the floor, the sheet that had covered it, lying crumpled in the corner. The man's expression had changed again, a faint smile playing at his lips. The smile sent a shiver down Thomas's spine. He didn't know what was happening, whether it was madness, exhaustion, or something else entirely. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the portrait was no longer just a painting. It was watching him, waiting for something. Desperate, Thomas decided to destroy the portrait. He grabbed a knife, his hands shaking as he stood before the canvas. But as he raised the blade, the man in the painting seemed to shift again, his eyes narrowing in warning. Thomas froze, a cold sweat breaking out across his skin. He couldn't do it. He couldn't bring himself to destroy it. It was as if the painting had some hold over him, some unseen force that prevented him from lifting the blade. That night, Thomas dreamt again, and this time it wasn't just a dream. He awoke to find the man from the painting standing at the foot of his bed, his eyes cold and empty. The figure was silent still, but the air in the room felt thick with an unspoken threat. When Thomas blinked, the figure was gone, but the feeling of being watched lingered. He stumbled into his studio, his eyes wide with fear, only to find the portrait staring back at him, the man's expression now one of amusement. Thomas knew then that the portrait would never let him go. It had become something more than just a work of art. It was alive, aware, and it was waiting for him to understand its true purpose. Some creations take on a life of their own, and some things are better left unfinished. So if you ever feel the eyes of a portrait watching you, remember, it's just a story. Or is it